Hey guys, this is Mike from Eldorado Guitars, and I am here on release day with the awesome Grace Deux Part 2. So you can see I've got both Graces here with me today. I've got the OG Grace up top, 100 watts, EL34 powered. And then down here I've got the Grace Deux, which is 20 watts, 6V6 powered. My favorite thing right off the bat that you'll probably notice is that both head shells are the same size, and I really personally love that. I kind of feel like with a lot of the mini amps that you end up feeling like you're getting like this kind of tiny sort of amp, you know, and I like that Brian made the choice here to sort of give you the full, you know, head shell to make it feel like this is a full amp, right? Kind of the exact same size as the big Grace. So I think that that is really, really cool. And of course, being 20 watts, 6V6, this is going to be a bit of a different sound than this amp, right? The 6V6 tubes are going to impart a different sonic signature, a little bit more highs and lows, a little more scooped mids than the EL34 version, which is going to give you more mids and a little bit softer highs. Also at 20 watts, you're going to be able to use this a little bit more practically. The master volume is excellent on both amps actually, but you're really going to be able to crank the 20 watt to get that power section cooking. And I think that that's really essential to the Carstens sound, because the Carstens sound is a big three-dimensional sound, and you really kind of got to get the amp cooking a little bit to get that sound. So really excited to see this version of the Grace here. So I want to walk you through this amp, and I'm not going to do a ton of knob turning, and I'll explain why in a second. But really what I want to do with this is kind of show you how versatile this amp is in a very unique way. So whereas a lot of the great amps that are in this room clean up, as they call it, very well, right? You're really kind of stuck with more or less the one bass sound that you're using, especially on a single channel amp, right? Like a Plexi or something, right? Like it might clean up really well if you turn your volume down and give you a nice clean tone, but you know, more or less it's kind of the same tone, just sort of cleaner to dirtier, right? As you turn your volume knob up. But the Grace is completely different. The Grace is a chameleon depending upon how your volume and tone controls are set. So all of the controls that you really need for this amp are not really actually on the amp, they're on your guitar, they're in your hands. And the Grace will really morph with your volume and tone controls. So whereas these other amps are more linear, right, like cleaner to gainier, right, as you turn your volume up, the Grace kind of goes through different phases. It feels like, and again, I don't know how Brian did this. I always joke with him that there's black magic inside of his amps, because I've never played an amp that does what this amp does, and that is that it really morphs with your volume control. Lower on the volume control, like 1 to 3, you're going to get a lot of Fender type cleans, right? From like 3 to 4, 3 to 5, you're going to get some of those heavier Fender sounds, right? Like pushed Blues Junior kind of sounds, right? Like more overdriven Fender style sounds. Then around like 5 or 6, you're going to get to more Plexi sounds. The mid-range is going to come up a bit in the amp. The highs are going to start to soften a bit, right? And then as you go up even further to like 7 or 8, you're going to get modded Marshall sounds, right? So you're going to get more bass, you know, softer treble attack, thicker mids. And then when you get all the way to 10, you're going to get a very dry, aggressive sound, almost like a diesel. So this amp, really, the EQ of the preamp feels like it changes a lot depending upon your volume and your tone controls. And again, I don't really know how that was achieved. Technically, you know, I'll leave that to the, you know, people that are smarter than me about all the capacitors and everything that are in these things. But it's really wild. I've never played an amp that does this. So let me just give you a quick example, right? You heard on the intro there, that was with the bridge pickup around 8 and then the neck pickup on 10. I'm going to go ahead and roll the neck pickup back. And let's roll it back to something like 2 or 3, and you're just going to hear a completely different amp. It's not going to be like a cleaned up version of that. It's going to be almost like a totally different sound and feel under your fingers, which is so important. So let me kind of show you what I mean here. I'm going to just dial in, and you can see I've touched no knobs, right? I'm just going to literally drop my volume control from 10 to 3, and we're going to get a really nice clean tone here on the neck pickup. So let's go ahead and check that out. Pretty wild, right? It's insane. The amp didn't just clean up, right? It totally shifted. It went from a very mid-heavy sound with rolled off highs and more bass to now a very Fendery, shimmery kind of sound, you know? I mean, it reminds me of the intro to Yellow Ledbetter or something, right? Like, you know, you can do like... Totally wild, right? Like it blows my mind. You can hear that what has happened is the highs and lows have gone up, and then the mids have come down, and you know the overall gain, of course, has dropped, and then now you've just got this beautiful, shimmering, clean sound. And then as we go ahead and turn it up, we're going to get more aggressive sounds. So, for example, if I go on, let's stay on the neck pickup for right now, right? I'll go from 3 to something like 4 or 5 here. And now we're going to get more of those like pushed kind of Fender sounds, right? So think like SRV or John Mayer or, you know, something like that. You're going to get that kind of type of sort of thing going on. So let's check that out. Awesome, right? So as you can see, right, like it kept a little bit of that V, right, but our mids came up a bit, right, and the gain came up, and we got just like a completely different amp almost, right, which is insane. Let's switch over to the bridge pickup, and I'll kind of show you some of the higher gain sounds. So if I were to switch over to my bridge pickup now, and I'm going to go ahead and keep it at something like let's do about 5. I think that's probably a pretty good place to start. This will be kind of the beginning of like the more Marshall-y type sounds. Again, I don't want to compare the Grace to like a Marshall or a Fender or a Diesel or whatever, but it's kind of more in that vein, right? So what we're going to hear now is the mids are going to start to come up. The highs are going to stay high, but the lows are going to stay low. So whereas maybe in the first one we got kind of a big V, right, for the clean sounds, and then we went to up to 4 to the push sounds, it was more of like a soft V. Right, now we're going to start to get a lower bass and then no V, right? We're actually going to push the mids up a little bit, and we're going to keep the treble high. So it's almost like this, right? So let's go ahead and set it to 5, and you'll kind of hear what I'm saying. This will be sort of, like I said, sort of think like that Plexi JTM 45 kind of type thing, you know? wild, right? So you can hear the mids have come up even more. The highs are still pretty high, but the bass is still nice and tight, you know, just like an old Marshall. As you keep going up to like 6, 7, you're gonna start to get into like that JCM 800 hot rodded kind of thing. So let's go ahead and I'll go up to about, let's do about like 6 to 7. I'll do like 6.5. And what you're gonna hear now is that the highs are actually gonna kind of start to soften a bit, and the mids are gonna keep coming up, and in conjunction with that, the bass is also gonna come up. So we're gonna get a bigger, thicker, fatter kind of sound from around like 7 to like 9 or so. So let's go ahead, it's right now about like 6.5, 7-ish. Let's go ahead and hear what that sounds like. So a lot of gain on tap there. As you can hear, we're getting into that modded Marshall territory. And again, I haven't touched any knobs, right? Literally, this is the same EQ that I have done the entire time, right? Which is wild and insane. And one thing you probably have noticed is that the gain knob is really not very high. I've got it right now at maybe like, I don't know, 10 o'clock or so, you know? So there is a ton more gain on tap in this amp, right? I mean, we're just starting to scratch the surface here. All right, now as I go up from 6 or 7 up to about 8 or 9, you're gonna get kind of the darkest sound. So one of the interesting things about this amp is you actually don't get the darkest sound on 10, which is what you usually get on a lot of old amps, right? You kind of get the biggest, thickest sound, you know, on 10, and you don't with this amp. You get it around like 8 or 9. So you're gonna hear the highs soften even more, and it's just gonna get really aggressive and chunky and in your face. So let's go ahead and check that out. I'm gonna put my volume up to about like 8.5 or so, and let's rock and roll. Push it to 10 real quick, and you're actually going to hear it brighten a bit, and it's just going to go over the top into dry fuzz diesel explosion. So as you can see, tons and tons and tons of gain available when you finally open everything up, right? And I haven't even really played with the tone controls very much, right? You can see I'm doing almost all of this with my volume knob, right? If I wanted to incorporate the tone knobs, I could get even more tones, right? So if I wanted like a smooth blues tone or something, right? I could go ahead and like maybe put my volume on my neck pickup, maybe around like 5 or 6 to get kind of an old Marshall-y sort of sound. Turn my volume, or sorry, my tone pot down to maybe like, you know, 4 or 5, and you're just gonna get a great singing blues voice. So for those blues lawyers out there, you've got some tones in there too for you if you use your volume and your tone controls, right? So this amp is just really, really super wild with just the tone and volume on your guitar. Now that said, you do have a full suite of options on the amp as well, right? So it is single channel. You got a presence, a master volume, bass, middle, treble, and of course your gain control. You also have a bright switch. I personally like the bright switch a lot. I think Brian pretty much recommends using it like when you're not turning up the amp super loud and that sort of thing, which I kind of rarely have the chance to turn up an amp super, super loud. I kind of feel like, you know, the amp really takes advantage of the bright switch when you roll your volume down. I think if you roll your volume down, like I was saying before, like let's put it back on like 3-ish or so, you know. You can hear it's got a really nice sparkle. If I turn it off, it's going to become a little bit more muffled. So I usually leave it on, but I just want to show you what I mean. Now, of course, I could turn the treble up more or whatever if I really wanted to, right? Or switch to the bridge pickup or whatever. But I just feel like the bright switch just kind of adds a little something to it, right? It just sort of brings a little bit of sparkle. So I usually leave it on. That kind of extra shimmer in it, and it works on the bridge pickup too, right? So if you like thicker sounds, you might want to turn it off, right? So for example, if I go back to my plexi kind of sound, which was this sort of thing, I'll go ahead and turn the bright switch off. So your mileage may vary, but you know, very simple amp, very simple controls. Now, one of the most interesting controls is actually on the back of this amp. So it's very difficult for me to show it to you right now in this recording, but on the back of the amp, there's only one knob, and that knob is what is called the headroom knob. And it's really kind of, I think it's actually like a variable negative feedback control. But what it basically does is it adds either more headroom to the amp, so it stays cleaner longer, and then the distorted parts become a little bit more compressed and a little bit more aggressive, or you can turn it down and have less negative feedback, in which case the headroom of the amp is reduced, but you get a very, very, very cool sound that I actually really like. It kind of reminds me a little bit of like a Nailer or a Friedman Naked or something. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I may re-EQ the amp as we do this, and then I'm going to switch to the OG Grace, and I want to show you guys a little bit of the difference between the two. So let me go ahead around to the back here, and right now, just for your awareness, I was running the Grace Deux with the headroom control 3/4 of the way up, so at about 3 o'clock, so pretty high. I actually don't normally run it there. I usually run it lower, but I wanted to show you kind of how much headroom this amp has and how much volume, or how many different tones it has with your volume control. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this back down, and I'm going to turn it exactly the opposite way, so I'm going to turn it to about 9 o'clock. So now you can hear the noise floor of the amp has come up a little bit because we've got less negative feedback in the circuit. So I'll go ahead and turn the volume knob and show you some sounds without changing any of the EQ, just so you can see what the impact of that was, right? So I'm going to flip back to my neck pickup first, and I've not touched anything, right? So let's see kind of what our clean tone sort of is now. dirtier, right? It's broken up a little bit more, right? It's giving me a little bit of breakup. Like I think like the Rhett Schulls of the world might call this edge of breakup, right? Which, whatever. But, you know, I think that's kind of, you know, you can hear that it's a little bit louder. It's got a little bit more mid-range. It's got a little less gain overall, which you'll find out in a second when I show you. And it's breaking up a little earlier, right? So I actually really dig this sound, though. It kind of reminds me of like old Red Hot Chili Peppers or something, you know, like... Now on the bridge pickup, you're going to hear we don't get very far before it breaks up on us. So that's pretty much as low as it goes. So you can hear it's breaking up a lot earlier, right? We're getting kind of a bigger, more of a roar from the amp as opposed to a kind of like greasier sort of sound. We're getting like a bigger, less compressed, a little bit more kind of in your face sort of sound. That way. I usually run it about there, in case you can't tell. I'm really into that sound. And then when you turn it up all the way, like I said, it's really kind of almost like a Friedman Naked. It gets this sort of like Nailer Naked kind of ripping, tearing, clawing kind of sound that really only those amps and this amp provide, which is really, really cool. So I'm going to turn it all the way up to 10 and let's just check it out. I love that sound. So as you can see, this amp, man, it is absolute insanity. I don't think I touched a EQ control the entire time we were standing here. And we got so many different sounds, right? I think I literally turned the brake switch off and then turned it back on, right? So you can see kind of how versatile this amp is. Now, one thing I want everybody, you know, everybody's probably sitting there saying, like, is Mike, hey, like, you've got the volume control on 10 o'clock, like, how much heat does this thing have, right? And the answer is tons. This is not a high output guitar. This bridge pickup, I think, is just over 8 ohms, and this neck pickup is, I think, 7.5 ohms. This is not a hot guitar, and you can hear we have gain for days at 10 o'clock, right? In fact, the Grace Deux, to me, feels like it has even more gain than this amp. Now, it probably doesn't really have more gain. It's probably the power section, right? But it in actuality, in the room, to your ear, it actually has more gain at lower settings. On the big Grace, you can see I have the gain actually turned up, right? So if you're really looking for like max gain, the Deux is really the way to go. But I'm gonna go ahead and turn the gain up. Let's turn it up to noon. I'm gonna set my volume, because obviously we're very sensitive to the volume control, right? And if I put it at 10, you can hear we're already blowing the place apart with gain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it to 5, and then I'm going to turn the gain control up so that you can hear. So I'm going to set my volume to 5, and then I'll turn the gain control up so that you can actually hear sort of how much effective gain we sort of have. Okay, so let's check it out. Even further. We're at max now. I'll turn the volume up to 10 just so you can hear the full max. Woo, so there is absolutely no shortage of gain on the Grace or the Grace Deux, right? Absolutely not. So that's why I usually leave it, you know, lower, because it gives the amp a little bit more versatility. But if you're looking for modern metal or whatever, you're gonna find it. Just turn up the, turn up your volume control, turn up the gain control. You're gonna find it. One secret I'll give you really quickly is I actually think if you're looking for a really gained out sound on this amp, what I would recommend actually is I would turn your volume control, your volume control on your bridge pickup, I would turn it to about like 6. And the reason I would turn it to 6 is because you're going to get a little bit more clarity at 6. You could hear when I had the gain really high, it still stayed tight, like especially when I was doing those palm mutes. But if you're like down tuning, right, if you're doing like E flat with a drop D, or you're playing in a D standard or something, it might get a little bit heavy on the bass. There is a lot of bass in these two amps. You can see I've got it turned down on the Deux. I think on the regular Grace, I've got it around noonish. This one's a little bit, the structure is different because of the power section. It's a little bit, I don't say tighter, that's not a right choice, but the bass sits in a different like frequency. But what I would recommend actually is turning your guitar to around like 6 so you can get more clarity, and then turning up the gain on the amp, because the amp is hot. You don't need a high output pickup or anything like that. I mean, if you have one, great, but you don't need one at all. The amp is plenty hot enough. So like, let me show you what I mean. If I turn this to 6, right, and then I'm going to turn the gain up to get to like a good kind of chug thing, you know? If I were you. I actually felt like with the gain turned up like that, we were getting like a really solid sound. I really liked it. One of the other things I'll give you is somebody actually asked me if this can do Mesa Boogie type sounds. And yeah, definitely, just you're gonna have to ride pretty high on your volume control, I think, to get that kind of dry diesel-y sort of thing, and you can get like a Mark type sound out of this. So let me show you what I mean. I'm actually going to pull the gain back a little bit. Let's set it to kind of around where I had it, around like 10 o'clock-ish or so. Should be plenty. And then if we want, let's say we want like a Master Puppets kind of thing or something, right? Like scoop the mids out, obviously. I mean, you know, you can be as aggressive with it as you want. And I'm actually going to lower the bass just a little bit more. And then I'm going to turn the guitar to 10 and like, let's just see what we get, man. It's going to rip. It's going to sound very similar to a Mark, you know? Control in the back. So for example, let's say you say like, you know, it's a little bit too MIDI, it's a little bit too in your face, like with the kind of like I said, that ripping, clawing sort of sound. Just turn the headroom control back to where we started, which is around 9 o'clock. And that's going to give you more compression, more negative feedback, and it's going to rip. Let's check it out. Thing there, but that was pretty fucking cool. So this amp continues to surprise me, right? It's like every time I plug it in, I find a new sound, which is amazing, you know? So, I mean, I own a 2C+, right? And I don't want to say that this is analogous to a 2C+, right? But it doesn't sound worlds off to me, right? So just a really, really, really powerful amp in a Really, really, really super, super small platform, right? 20 watts, very easy. So now I'm gonna switch over to the regular Grace, and let's just see how the two compare really quickly. I'm not gonna do like a full review on this. But I do want to show you kind of the difference here. So let me just go ahead and make sure that I've got this set appropriately. Great. Okay, perfect. All right, so the 100 watt Grace. So what is different while this is warming up for just a minute? What is different about the 100 watt Grace? First of all, it operates on EL34 power tubes, not 6v6s, so it's going to have a very different sound. It's a lot louder. It's like insanely loud. It's super loud. Especially if you take that headroom control like I was mentioning and turn it back to the 9 o'clock position with less, it's just wildly loud. It's so loud. That's actually, if you've never played a Friedman Naked, that's why the Naked is so loud, because it has very little negative feedback. So it's just insanely loud. So it has a little bit of a different sound, I would say. Again, I wouldn't say it has less gain. I'm sure the preamp is probably the same, just the way it interacts with the power section is different. So the gain curve on this is a little bit more manageable, I think is how I would put it, right? It's a little bit more manageable. I do like the mid-range a little bit better on this one, probably because I'm an EL34 guy. I think the reason I usually run this amp with the headroom control around noon, 1 o'clock, maybe 2 o'clock. So I usually actually run the headroom on this one higher. The Deux, I usually run it lower, like I mentioned before, around, I usually run it around 9 o'clock, yeah, lower. And I think the reason I'm doing that is because I'm trying to bring the mids up like a little bit. So I think this one with the EL34s has a little bit more mid-range presence. And I think just like to my ear, I like that, right? So let's go ahead and fire it up, and we'll see what we get here. Oh, it would help if I plugged into the amp. Oh, it would also help if I actually plugged in the correct jam here. Okay. Sorry about that. Let's try again. There we go. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and I'll pop to the neck pickup real quick and just do some clean stuff. I don't know if you can hear this on YouTube, but it's much louder in the room. I'm actually going to turn the speaker out here down a bit because it's much, much louder in the room. Are a bit different. They've got a little bit more mid-range. They're a little less scooped. I think it sounds more like a Marshall clean. I would liken the clean on this one to more like the Jubilee clean, which is a great clean, right? Great, great, great clean, but just not quite as bouncy as a Fender clean, you know? Yeah, the highs are a little softer, and it's got a little bit more mid-range, which I think is indicative of the EL34 power section, right? So I'll go ahead and start to turn it up here. Let's switch over to the bridge pickup. different sound, different thing. Both amps are very similar, right? You know, I'm sure a lot of people are going to say, like, Mike, which one should I choose? You know, it's up to you. As Dave Friedman would say, it depends, right? I mean, do you want a 100 watt amp, right? Or do you want a 20 watt amp, right? I think probably the real question, though, is not really about wattage. It's really just about what you're doing and which power section you prefer. I think really, if you know, soup came to nuts, what would I do? I'd probably pick the big Grace because I like EL34s and I like that sound. You could probably tell I was maybe like playing a little bit of different stuff there, some Van Halen and whatnot, because the sound of this reminds me a lot more of that, right? Whereas this one I like a lot more for actually lower gain sounds. I like the Deux a lot more for cleans, kind of those Fender sounds, edge of breakup sounds, even like the Plexi type JTM 45 stuff. I actually prefer this one even though it's 6v6. I do have 6 CA7s in my old Plexi, so maybe that's why, I don't know. But I really love for like the higher gain stuff, you know, like 6 and up on the volume knob. I really love the full Grace because those EL34s, especially when you turn the master up and you really get them cooking. I'm not saying you got to crank it, right? But I mean, like I've got it up, you know, about like I don't know, like 10 o'clock or 10:30, which without this attenuator would be extremely loud. And it just really kind of comes to life. I set the EQs pretty similar on both. I did have the bass a little higher on the 100 watt Grace, and you probably heard it's not quite as boomy, right? It's a little bit tighter, and it's a little bit more controllable. This one, the bass is a little bit bigger in the room, like it spreads out more in the room, whereas this one is more focused. I think I prefer that also. But this one I really like I said, for the lower gain stuff. And really, like I said, if you want max gain, I mean, this one might actually have a little more gain because you can turn that power section up. So for the modern metal guys, this might be a suitable solution as well. So both are great amps. And, you know, I just want to thank Brian for always being awesome. And, you know, giving me the serial number 1 down here was so awesome. You know, and this was my first one here. I have a War Machine also that's great. If you've never checked out his amps, please check them out. They're super, super cool. No other amp responds the way that these amps do. No other amps sound like this. No other amps respond to your guitar and your playing and your volume and tone controls and your dynamics like this. And you would never know this is a 1-channel amp. As long as you're in command of your guitar and you know what you're doing, you would never know you had a 1-channel amp. And you never really have to even touch the EQ once you get it set the way you like it. So really, check them out. Awesome amps. Again, this is Mike from Eldorado Guitars. Please like, subscribe. Really does help me out. And thanks, guys. Have a good rest of your week. Peace.